Hello there, and welcome back to the Disconnected. Here today with Facial Recognized, Dr. Will Dodson, joining me to speak with Joseph Maddrey, the author of The Soul of Wes Craven, book you've probably been seeing everywhere over the last year or so. So as you do in all this, thanks for making your time to do this, Joseph.
Thank you for having me.
And then, of course, the obvious first question. So how many times were you asked why you wrote a book about Wes Craven over the last year?
All of them, all of the times.
I mean, many of us close to this subject, we know why it's important to talk about Wes Craven. And as we've all kind of alluded to, each of the other major creators and names in the space have had sort of their glory years, but it seems like it's finally Wes's time, thankfully.
Yeah, well, there does seem to be a bit of a trend lately, or in the last 10 years with horror filmmakers, that when you die, you get a kind of an instant reappraisal. I think it sort of happened. It happened in a big way, I think, with Tobe Hooper.
Yeah.
Probably on a much bigger level than even what's happened with Wes. And then George Romero, all of his stuff getting donated to the University of Pittsburgh, and them starting up the horror studies program there, kind of built around that archive, is huge. So it's been, it's an exciting time for horror nerds.
It kind of seems like it always is, but it's nice that we get these cycles at least. The book is incredible. I'm so glad to see somebody giving this type of love and attention. And obviously, you have many reasons for writing about him. But I'm curious for you, was there an original draw that made you say, I feel personally attached because of this specific aspect?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation. So I approached Wes in 2010, or maybe 2009. And it was actually for a documentary. He wasn't available for an interview for the documentary. So I kind of bluffed my way in and said, I want to write a book about you someday, because I still wanted to have the interview. And I was really fascinated with his work. And I think in a way, kind of more fascinated with the stories that I'd heard about his upbringing and the things that he'd said about the connection between kind of his early childhood religious experience and family experience, and how that kind of inspired, and inspired may not be the right word, in an oblique sort of way, the films that he ended up making. And that was just something that I wanted to hear more about. And because I really didn't have a big agenda going into the interview that I did with him, I wasn't chasing sound bites for a documentary, and we didn't really even have to talk about horror movies. We ended up having a fairly personal conversation, which I think is why it was a good conversation. I think he wasn't used to people, coming in and asking about him anything other than the obvious, what made you make Last House on the Left, or how did you come up with the idea of Freddy Krueger, that kind of stuff. And so, I think I had just written a book about T.S. Eliot, and so this was kind of part of the resume that I brought to the table to convince him to do the interview. And he said, yeah, I studied Eliot when I was getting my master's degree at Johns Hopkins. And so, right off the bat, we were kind of talking about things other than horror films. And I think that was what made it a good conversation. And then I just waited too long to write the book. I was working with Lance Henriksen on some stuff, and I delayed, and somebody else put out a new book on Wes Craven, and I thought the ship had sailed until actually a few years after Wes had died. And I went back and listened to the recording of that interview, and said, this was actually, there's a lot of stuff here that has not been in any of the books about Wes that I'm still really interested in. And I kind of gave myself the challenge of trying to track down some of the stuff that he talked about that he had been writing in high school and college, and track down some of the people that he talked about. And I was very surprised how much success I had with that. And it made me realize just nobody had gone down that road before. And I was fascinated by the things that I was reading and the people that I was meeting. So it just became a 4-year obsession that I really delved into on that level because I'm not sure anybody else is going to. And I'm in sort of a unique position to just keep chasing this and try to put out a book that, that covers all this stuff that nobody else has really looked at with Wes.
There's a point around the middle of the book in which, and I think this is from a previously published interview, perhaps not, if my memory is wrong, correct me, but Wes says at some point your life just becomes the work that you're doing. And the only time that's not true is at the beginning and the end.
Yeah.
And what you've done that nobody else has done in conducting these interviews, and especially going through archives that nobody else had gone through, which we'll get to specifically, is you fleshed out his youth and his teenage and early adult years, and the kind of self-reflection and relationship repair and building and a sort of new beginning in terms of his personal relationships, his personal life in his later years. That was just amazing. Stuff that I'd never heard before, and I've read pretty much everything that had been published on him previously. In particular, you get into his early life, his relationship or lack of relationship with his father, and fraught relationship with his mother, leading to his time at Wheaton College, where he quickly became editor of the literary magazine, which was the origin of a particular pseudonym that we're going to get to a little bit later in this interview. And I'd like to jump right into the literary magazine and the type of persona he was getting into. You mentioned you wrote a book, actually 2 books on T.S. Eliot, which is one place you and Craven kind of intersected in terms of your literary interests. Can you talk a little bit about Craven, the college, English major, guitar player, poet?
Yeah, I think, I think that the Wheaton College chapter is probably my favorite chapter in the book. And it's not just because it exposes what a literary-minded guy Wes was, the things that he was reading, but also because it's the first time I think where he was really in a community of people who were equally intellectual and not just intellectual. I mean, Wheaton College certainly was academically rigorous, but who were also the people that he found himself in this community with. I think were all kind of seekers. They all were coming from some kind of religious background, and then sort of having it, deepened or upended at Wheaton College. And so I really think that time and place was kind of revolutionary on a deeply personal level for Wes and for all of the people that I talked to who were around him and who were friends with him during that time. So I think just as I say, I was so interested in the literary mind of Wes, but also this was such a great insight talking to people about who he was, and that everybody would kind of describe him as, sort of a quiet, shy, unassuming in some ways person, but also, he was, I believe it was during his freshman year that he was actually writing satire, kind of poking fun at the administration at Wheaton, at their self-righteousness, under his pseudonym of Abe Snake, and so he obviously had this kind of mischievous side to him, and a side that wanted to be really kind of irreverent and outspoken, and I think the part of him that gravitated towards satire and toward had kind of a dark sense of humor was the part of him that inside was really damaged feels like too broad a word, but who had a lot of existential angst and a lot of shit to work out that was related to not having a father growing up, and to kind of the transitional neighborhood that he grew up in, and to having a very devoutly fundamentalist mother, and belonging to a fundamentalist church at a time when he, I think, was trying to believe some of the things that he was, sort of indoctrinated into, but just wasn't really feeling, wasn't really connecting, and felt kind of rejected, and like he just didn't have a place in the world. Just didn't know where he belonged, didn't know who he was, just felt like a freak, I think, on some level, as a lot of, future horror filmmakers and writers. That's a common thread. But I think the first time where he had a community of people who were outsiders, maybe not for the exact same reasons or in the exact same way that he was, but he found a community of outsiders. And I think that was where Wes Craven started to really become Wes Craven, as a human being, not the brand, and not necessarily a horror storyteller, but he, I think, developed a lot of confidence in himself and in these aspects of himself that up until then had seemed problematic or contradictory. And so I don't know. I've rambled now so much that I don't even remember what your initial question was. But that's just me talking about. I love that chapter because I do think that knowing what he went through at Wheaton and who he was at Wheaton informs every single story he told after that, and every film. I mean, I really think that was where he was kind of forged in the fire of Wheaton College. And had he not been, I don't think we would have gotten to any of the stuff that he did after that, because I don't think that he would have kind of solidified this sort of inner struggle that he had enough to be able to articulate it later.
What's interesting with, comparing this to many of the other books that have come out on not even just like horror icons, but a lot of people in this industry, at least, they sort of gloss over those early years. They don't really get a lot of details that inform the later work, because I think a lot of the people that write these think most people are just interested in that later work. But
well, to be fair, a lot of people are. I mean, I've seen some reviews online, and people go, "Well, it got boring, so I skipped to the first movie, and then it got interesting." I mean, that's but I think they're missing out.
Yeah. I would agree.
I'm not at all biased, but I think they're missing out.
As somebody that really prides myself in interviewing, I'm very curious, because you did, upwards of like 100 interviews for this book, and you mentioned the amount of success that you were able to feel just in getting those interviews. What is your process like? As somebody that wants to be potentially a documentarian someday, I'd love to hear how you open up and build rapport with these people.
Well, the smart ass answer is that I was pursuing these interviews in the early days of COVID, and everybody was sitting around bored at home with nothing to do. So and I'm sure that just getting people on the phone was easier because of that. Because I've been working actually in documentary television now for 25 years. I don't shy away from the cold call. When you're interested in knowing something, reach out. I love it when people reach out to me. You wrote a book on something I'm interested in, and people just pop up and ask you questions. I mean, I think most people are kind of receptive to that, unless they in some way feel like they're being exploited somehow.
Right.
And I worried, I think, a little bit going into this, that especially with people from his childhood in Cleveland, and from Wheaton College, that they would maybe not want to be connected to Wes Craven because of religious differences. I wasn't really sure what the reaction was going to be there. I believe that the first two people I connected with were Mary Bloxma and Bill Schopf, who had gone to Wheaton with Wes, but who also then were part of the master's program that he was in at Johns Hopkins, and they were the only, I think the only two people who overlapped with him with both of those college experiences. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, the first interview or two on a big project is always kind of telling. You know, it tells you, it gives you your footing or it doesn't. I think that both Mary and Bill could kind of tell that I wasn't just interested in Wes for the horror stuff, that I actually, you know, my interest in Wes's literary interest and in his religious background, I think made them go, okay, well, this is worth talking about, because I don't think either one of them, in fact, many of Wes's Wheaton peers and childhood friends, and even later in life friends, not horror people. And so those would have been very short conversations. Well, you know, what do you know about Wes, you know, creating Freddy Krueger? That would have been a dead end. Those would have been very short conversations. You know, I was much more interested in him as a person, and because throughout his life he had so many people who really cared about him and valued him as a presence in their lives. People were happy to talk about him as a person, and just as my conversations with Wes tended to, my conversation with Wes veered away from horror. My conversations with the people who knew Wes very rarely revolved around the genre or around his films even. And I, you know, a lot of the people who had been his collaborators and people who were involved in making the films with him, they're already on the record in a lot of places, and I didn't feel like I had to go chase those people down again and do those interviews. That work has been done, and I in the book could just allude, you know, to where you find that stuff if that's what you're interested in, you know, and kind of fair use a quote here and there, but you know, but by and large, I felt like that had been done, and some of it needs to be in the biography for context. But it was, how much can we add to his story? How can we deepen the story? And again, I felt like I was in a unique position, or had a unique responsibility to do that, because, you know, people don't live forever, and Wes was gone, and you know, and starting work on this, doing the interviews at the beginning of COVID, I think had an effect too, because there were a number of people that I interviewed who were in their 80s and some of them in their 90s in the early days of putting this book together. They're gone now.
Damn.
Well, going back to Wheaton College.
Sorry, that was sobering.
No, that actually leads to several questions I want to get to. All related really to the title of the book, right? The Soul of Wes Craven. Going back to Wheaton, and just to be clear for any of the heathens listening to this interview, Wheaton College is an evangelical school. The place, this is where Billy Graham went to school.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that on their list of notable alumni, both Wes Craven and Billy Graham are there. So the early chapters, or really the first quarter of the book, is there's this mounting tension between Craven as a literary thinker, a creative person, someone who is struggling with feelings about faith and belief and family and who he is. Like there are several instances of you know, him struggling with self-doubt, and you quote liberally from some poetry and some of his some essays as Abe Snake, satirical essays from the archives. Well, I mean, how would you describe the literary voice of this young Wes Craven?
Well, one of the things that you notice, well, even before Wheaton, really, I mean, the first sustained, you know, writing work that he had done, I guess, was a series, a column of they're not really, they're not satire. The articles that he wrote in for his high school newspaper, which were called Craven's Ravens, was more like a sort of a Mad Magazine humor type of thing. And he would, it's funny, you read them now and you can see in them the darkness of a kid who doesn't really know his place, or feels like people close to him don't approve of him, and yet he's masking that with humor. I remember the one that stands out in my mind was he did I guess it was in the early January issue. He was talking about Christmas at the Craven house, and how he'd gotten a present from his mother that was a do-it-yourself kit with like a noose and a dagger or something like that. And he's facetiously going, I can't understand what yourself. I don't get it. And yet there's a darkness behind that, because he did have issues with his mother. I mean, he had said in some of the heavier interviews that he did, he would pretty much say, I grew up feeling like my mother didn't love who I really was, didn't understand me, didn't and that's hard for anybody. So I think the darkness masked by humor was always there. The Abe Snake persona, which I was really, I had done enough, internet searching to know about the Abe Snake, porn movie. And so I knew that pseudonym, and it was wild to connect it to some stuff he was doing at Wheaton College, at this evangelical college, was a bit of a wow. And it just happened because somebody I was talking to, that I was interviewing, who really wasn't close to Wes and really didn't have much to say. I don't even think he's quoted in the book by name, but he he just said, yeah, I remember freshman year you'd post these things in the dining hall and poking fun at the administration, but he wouldn't sign his own name on them. He used some silly ass name like Abe Snake or something. My ears kind of perked up and wait, say that again. But they were never published. He would put them up. They were taken down immediately. The administration never, as far as I know, found out who was doing this. So he was still a bit of the kind of prankster and instigator, secret instigator, I think, in the early, at least his freshman year at Wheaton. Something happened then where he suffered he suffered a paralysis. He had a virus that basically turned into a condition that was never, I think, formally diagnosed, but which left him paralyzed for a period of months. I've read the chest down and waist down, and I'm not sure which one is accurate, but either way, that's some scary shit. He was sick, got up feverish to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, couldn't get up, and was taken to the infirmary on campus, and then the local hospital, and then had to go home with his single mother, who didn't understand him / didn't love him in his view, having to do everything for him, and he was bedridden, and I think I know at least one family member said he was suicidal at that time. And so he wrote for the literary magazine at Wheaton after that experience. And there is a change of tone, and there's also a bit of trying on different voices and different personas. There's a very melancholy poet version that he would sign these. what was it? What was his W.E. Craven? Which I think was because he was reading T.S. Eliot and thought, oh, that's, if you're a poet, you use initials. That's my theory, anyway. And then he started, within a year or less than a year, he was writing short stories that were had a bit of a more of a kind of overt philosophical component to them. The poems were more sort of tone, I think, and then he decided that he was going to write kind of statement pieces, and those were under the name Wesley Craven, which was interesting to see that, because apparently he hated, his mother would call him Wesley, so he hated when people called him Wesley, because that was what his mother called him. And usually, I'm sure, when he was in trouble for something, that's when you use the full name. But that was the important, the self. I mean, I use my name, my full. I'm Joseph on my book, so I can talk. But then he had another pseudonym, Thomas Sparrow, and I think he did some shorter poetry, and he also did some kind of visual art, some watercolors, some photography, I think. So he was trying on, I think, different personas, and which is what you do at that age. I mean, you mimic until you sort of find your own voice in the midst of this aggregate of influences. And I think he had. I think when he got to Johns Hopkins, which he did that first year after graduating from Wheaton. So this is 63, 64. He wrote a novel called Noah's Ark, The Journals of a Madman. And I think that's really his voice. I mean, it's much more, again, kind of overtly philosophical than anything we think of with the horror films. It's pretty dense reading. He was reading a lot of Proust, and it's not short. It's very kind of psychologically complex, and it's him clearly doing a fictionalized self-analysis. So for a biographer, it's absolutely fascinating. But I really think that's where he kind of established, here's my voice going forward. And then he was writing short stories and I think tried a couple of additional novels at that time. Including, I think, an early run of Fountain Society. He said he came up with that idea in 1972. So that's many, many years before he actually wrote the thing and got it published. But I don't know if he took a pass at it, at writing it at that time or not. But he wanted to be a writer, just out of college. I mean, that's what he was going to be. He was teaching. He went into teaching college for a few years, and he was trying to get Noah's Ark published, trying to get short stories published, submitting them to different magazines. And it just wasn't happening. It turned out to be a dead end. Had he gotten any one of those things published, I think he probably would have doubled down and not found his way to cinema.
Yeah, it was actually while teaching, right, that he got interested, working with some of his students. He got interested in entering the film industry.
Yeah, I think he was seeing a lot of films and kind of European art house films at the school where he was teaching, and he just went, "Wow, because he didn't grow up with film. I mean, the church that he was in, so that's the work of the devil. You're not allowed to see films, and he certainly didn't grow up on science fiction or horror films. And so he was a young teacher in his 20s before he really discovered cinema, and it even thought about it as a medium that he could work in.
Well, maybe then to fast forward a little bit, speaking of films being of the devil, his first two films.
Yep.
Right. So the story of Last House on the Left has been told, so
yep.
we won't linger on that. Although you actually, I think, offer some really interesting insights on the writing of that film. But after Last House on the Left, he found himself almost persona non grata because people were so disturbed by the movie. And so The next film he did, as you alluded to, was in the adult industry.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us are familiar with his pseudonym on the film Angela, the Fireworks Woman, Abe Snake. I had always recognized, of course, the erotic connotations, but not until your book did it hit on me that these are religious connotations as well.
Right.
And in fact, the pornographic film that he made is a very, shall we say, spiritual film.
Yeah, which is strange, right? Don't you even feel kind of weird saying that?
Yeah. yeah. Especially because I'm going to send the link to this to my mom.
Yeah. Well, sorry, Mom. Yeah, and that's not a film that he acknowledged by name or wanted to talk about. In fact, before I'd even started working on the book, so I guess about a year before he passed, I got a note to him through a mutual friend and just said, "Can we please talk about the Fireworks Woman?" And my friend said, he gave the note to Wes. Wes looked at the note, read it, started laughing, and then just got really serious. Said, "No, I don't talk about that."
Well, and to be clear, before we get into a discussion of it, the adult industry was very different than it is now, and certainly still not considered legitimate cinema. But this was the era of porn chic, of Deep Throat.
And I mean legitimacy, right? Legitimacy is an interesting word because what gives you legitimacy? Well, usually money,
right?
In America.
That's what I mean by
it. I mean, there were porn films. I'm just going to brazenly use that instead of saying adult films. We'll call them what they are. We're in the top 10, grossing pictures of that. I mean, it's like there's The Godfather, and then whatever, The Devil and Miss Jones. I mean, it was a different time, clearly, but it was also, I think that the thing that people who haven't done a little research or aren't old enough to have been around for that maybe don't realize is, they had stories and ambitious stories. I mean, not just stories that were about, well, what is a taboo that we can break? Although, clearly that's there too, because again, you want to make money. But, thematically, some of these films were made by people who really had artistic ambitions and who had something to say. And I think, certainly Wes got into this, grudgingly, and it was like, well, somebody is willing to hire me to write and direct a film. And this is it's gotta tick off these boxes. And I mean, that's what happened with Last House too. It was like he didn't want to make a horror movie. In fact, his reaction when somebody tried to hire him to make a horror movie was, "I don't know anything about horror movies." That's why would you even consider hiring me for that? I have no expertise whatsoever. But people aren't knocking down his door. He didn't go to film school. He doesn't really have any credentials, where people would hire him. So if somebody's going to hire you to do this thing that you want to do, even under the conditions that you don't want it to be under, you just go, well, can I do both? And that's how the Fireworks Woman came about. Although we had learned the lesson from Last House to when you're going to do that and you're going to break all those taboos, don't put your real name on it. Although he acts in the film fully clothed, but I guess he's going, well, Mom and the her fellow parishioners from the church are going to be watching this film and go, hey, wait a minute, that's Wes. And if they do, they can't really call you on it, can they? Because, well, how would you know?
It's true. But yeah, he is unmistakably.
He is the devil figure at the center of that story. Yeah, who's doing that kind of prankster role in a way, in the sense that his character is the one kind of posing the questions of it's a complicated story in that. So it's like on the surface, it's this, it's exploiting the taboo. It's a brother and sister. It's an incest story. But beyond the idea of the taboo, there's this thing where it's like they seem to really love each other. And the sex scenes where the brother and the sister get together are shot through this gauzy filter with beautiful music. And there's almost a like vaguely religious quality to that. Like he's and that's juxtaposed with some really ugly, nasty sex scenes in the film, where it's clear that the two people do not love or care about each other, and there's this contrast there, and it's almost like as the filmmaker and as this sort of devil character at the center of it, like he's posing this question of, all right, you've got these two types of sex scenes in this film. We understand what's wrong with one type, but really, isn't the other one just something that we should be looking at going, yeah, that's pretty, normal and beautiful, and they're in a loving relationship, and I feel like he's making sort of a comment. I mean, granted, they're brother and sister. There is that, but I feel like he's making his own little comment there about sort of puritanical values, and yeah, I mean that was the era of porn chic. I mean that's right there, waiting to be pounced on as an issue. So that's the question everybody was asking was, is there some kind of is this evidence that we're as a culture not repressing as much and maybe becoming more open-minded, becoming more European, as it were, or are we becoming more debased as a culture that porn is mainstream?
Yeah, there is this really interesting tension between guilt and repression and hedonism and exploitation that I think recurs throughout his filmography. And it's interesting. This is one of two, right, of his films that have yet to be released in any physical format. So maybe this reappraisal will lead to some renewed interest in it.
Yeah, I'm sure there must be a rights issue, because years ago there was some talk about I've forgotten who it was. One of the labels was going to put this out, and now I've completely forgot, because that was 10 years ago when I had that conversation, and I've completely blanked on who it was that was going to put it out. The only official release that I'm aware of was an Italian version, which actually used a different edit of the film than the one that is on the internet for those who want to dare, who want to test their computers, antivirus software.
Well, and as was contractually required in the era, there is an appearance by Jamie Gillis towards the end. So there are many reasons to.
I mean, there's a big orgy scene at the end that's got pretty much everybody in it. Yeah. That's another sobering moment. Where do you go from there? Wow. All right.
Well, to make it personal then, after this, before we get into some of the more well-known horror movies and talk about some of those anecdotes, you obviously spent a lot of time, with his essence for this and with him and becoming deeply familiar with every aspect of his life. Are there any, certain memories that made you suddenly feel even more attached or like in admiration of this individual?
I don't know. It's hard to think of, so much of it was just this cumulative sense that he made an impact on the lives of people who, in some cases, knew him for an extremely short period of time. Just it seemed like everybody who came in contact with him was like, yeah, he's got an intensity about him and a seriousness about him, and he seemed to have this ability to, in a very short amount of time, kind of empathize with people enough to be able to talk to them on the topics and kind of on the same level that they wanted to communicate on. And actually, I think he, to some degree, did that with me, where I showed up and thought, I'm interviewing him. And he kind of started off with like, so who are you? Why do you want to do this? Where are you coming from? What's your interest in my stuff? And it was like, he wanted to learn about me. And, and again, because I wasn't interviewing him for anything specific, I mean, I rolled with that. And I told him about my childhood and growing up in the church and gravitating toward philosophy as a teenager and literature and T.S. Eliot and all this stuff. And I did kind of the abbreviated version of that, and sort of how horror films and his horror films specifically kind of fit into all that for me, that I liked a certain type of horror film that was dealing with metaphysical issues, and that I thought he did that better than most. And once he sort of knew what I was interested in, where I was coming from, he said, okay, well, look, there's actually, some kind of overlaps in our life experiences and in the things that we're interested in. So let me sort of, give you my version of that, of how I grew up and how all of that sort of evolved, and how, you get out of the church and you have to kind of, you have a void there that sort of has to be filled by something very big.
Right.
And, and that's where philosophy and literature and those sort of things come in. And how you forge your identity. And so we had a conversation that was about that. And I think this is just something that Wes, because he was a serious person and he was always questioning and he was deeply curious about everything and about people, that he asked a lot of questions, and he wasn't just waiting to talk. And he wasn't, I mean, I think on some level, it's funny because I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about how, a lot of really successful artists tend to be narcissists. But I think, and I think that on some level, clearly his brand and, his legacy to some degree, and, obviously the work, what he was putting out into the world, all of that stuff was very important to him, but not for its own sake. I mean, I think he was really very conscious of why am I putting this out into the world? And is it not just for me, but is it of some value to other people? Because if it's not, then maybe I just shouldn't be doing it. And I'm sure that started with Last House with the sort of the critical drubbing and also the becoming kind of a pariah among the people who knew him. You start to go, the way he put it was, am I all of the things that my church warned me about? He was taking classes and working, with one mentor, I think in particular, with Clyde Kilby, and then Elliot Coleman at Hopkins, Clyde Kilby at Wheaton and Elliot Coleman at Hopkins, guys who were really, examining this question that was very big at that time and place about Christianity and art. And, what does it mean to be a Christian artist? And can you even be both? Because fundamentalist Christianity, at least the church he grew up in, the Fundamentalist Baptist Church that he grew up in, said, stay away from all things worldly. So, you stay away from cinema, you stay away from literature, you, to some degree, stay away from art. Because there's the heavenly and there's the worldly, and never the twain shall meet. Or if they do, you're going to hell. And I think that was baked into him from an early age. I mean, he said the big value of having grown up in the church for him was that it made him ask big questions. And he went through his whole life asking big questions. And he had this amazing ability to balance that with, things that were very commercial, with something that could be exploited for money, something that was popular, something that a lot of people cared about, but that also had layers to it. I think that's what makes Wes unique.
Well, and sticking with that, wrestling with spiritual matters. As I was reading the book, I did something that I had not done before, which is as I came towards the end, I began in my mind comparing Craven's work to that of David Cronenberg. And it created a contrast that kind of locked in an interesting, to me, difference in their approaches, right? Cronenberg is very scientific, biological, body,
Yeah.
right? And sites of trauma are physical.
Yeah, and also atheistic.
And atheistic, right? I saw an interview with him, red carpet interview about the shroud, where someone asked him what happens when you die, and he just smiled and said nothing.
and very comfortable with that. Yeah, I mean, spoken like a true existentialist. Yeah.
But Craven, on the other hand, really did see this spiritual, psychological, whatever divide, and you see that in films like obviously Elm Street and Shocker and Serpent in the Rainbow and even Angel and the Fireworks Woman. This wrestling with questions of selfhood and faith and the intersection of the physical and the metaphysical. And it occurred to me that a person who is paralyzed for any amount of time is going to experience a mind-body divide in ways that others cannot. Even as we understand neurologically, our brain is distributed throughout our body. When our bodies stop working, but our minds continue to be able to imagine and project, we experience that so differently. And it seemed to me such a key anecdote in the book that resonated throughout the rest of his life, like both professionally and spiritually, like the need to keep going, right? Never stop. And this questioning of the nature of who am I, and I don't know if I'm even leading into a question. It just seems like that was constantly the question he was asking,
Yeah, you said so many things there that I should have been like keeping notes, because that actually sent my brain off in a few different directions. One is that he actually kind of wrote a short story at Wheaton that was about the mind-body divide. And it was, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but it was basically about a guy who, it's like a dialogue between the brain and the body, or between the brain and the stomach specifically, that the guy's stomach is upset, and he ends up, the brain ends up kind of, going to like pours a big pitcher of boiling hot water down his throat as revenge on the stomach for acting up. And it's just like, that the brain would feel separate enough as an identity from the body to punish the body in that way. I mean, it was clearly something that the brain-body divide was something that he was thinking about and starting to kind of, put into his work. I think, unlike David Cronenberg, who's obviously known for body horror, I mean, I think you're right that Wes is more sort of spiritual horror. He definitely wasn't an atheist. Although I think he was really careful not to kind of ever try to codify what he was. I would sort of look at him and go, well, he's an agnostic. And I think that's partly because I'm an agnostic. I would also say, well, he's an agnostic who gravitates toward mysticism, very interested in mysticism. That might be because I'm an agnostic who gravitates toward mysticism. I'm not sure. Those are things that interest me in his work, kind of exploring them in that context. But he was clearly he was an environmentalist. He was very kind of devoted to nature as a real world expression of of spirituality, or maybe what he thought that religion should be able to provide to people. So yeah, you covered a lot of ground there, and I have forgotten. There were three things, and the third one has now flown out of my brain. But you made some good points there, and I think.
Well, I think they emerged from the book. These are things that I had not really thought of with regard to Craven before, and in fact, I wish you had published this about a year earlier while I was working on my own Wes Craven projects, because I would have incorporated it.
Well, I loved your essay. I mean, that's how we met, right? I loved your essay on Hills Have Eyes too, and I just, because you had made some. I studied Hills too, trying to come up with something intelligent to say about it, and I think I failed. And then I read your essay, and I was like, "Son of a bitch, he got it!" And so I was impressed. I think that's how we met. I had to email you and go, "Hey, buddy, you're a man after my own heart, and good job."
Well, I so appreciated that. Well, that can lead into maybe backing up and talking about how 2023 and 2024 suddenly have been this year of Craven, because what you're referring to, that essay, I contributed to a volume called Refocus, the Films of Wes Craven, which Colin Waddell edited for the University of Edinburgh Press. And that came on the heels of a second book, a critical companion to Wes Craven, which I wrote about the television films. And those were the first two academic studies. And then a third one came out that I was unfamiliar with and irritated they didn't invite me to contribute. The theology of which I just learned about from your blog. So those three books came out around the same time.
Those were all 2023.
And then the Soul of Wes Craven becomes. I mean, I don't think it's blowing smoke to say that this is the definitive biography. Well, as you say, many of the people you interviewed are already gone. And this paints such a wonderfully nuanced picture of a human being. I found myself getting very moved in parts, and we'll come to that later. But, as you say, when artists, filmmakers, musicians, when they pass away, suddenly there's this renewed appreciation and reappraisal. And I think it's fantastic that Craven has gotten this attention, and that we're talking now about his soul, his humanity, in ways that critics had kind of mischaracterized or stereotyped him as this grisly.
Well, I like to think, and I hope that it's in ways that Wes would have appreciated.
Yeah.
That's kind of the goal.
Well, and the thing I don't know how much he might have appreciated it. He might have appreciated the perspective it gave him, but you really.
Yeah, I should qualify that, actually, because I have said this many times, that on one hand, I think he would have really appreciated the seriousness with which I pursued. On the other hand, I think he would have been horrified by how much digging I did, and kind of how deep into his life I went, just almost in a why would anybody care enough to go so deep into my life. But I think he's a fascinating person. And I think that knowing where he was coming from as a person really does, at least for me, it changes the way I watch those movies. And I love those movies. So to deepen the experience of something that I already love, I mean, to me, that's the whole objective of writing a book like that. That's the point.
Yeah. Well, family and trauma and revisiting trauma, I mean, those are themes people can pick out pretty easily. But I think where you really deepen it to, at times, heartbreaking depths, I guess, is when you get into his fraught feelings about his own father. And his father also grew up, fatherless. And then his own fatherhood, which he and his first wife divorced. His kids were raised with the mother while he was pursuing his career. His communication, in particular with his son Jonathan, could at times be very difficult.
Yeah.
And you have some wonderful interviews with Jonathan, with Jessica, anecdotes about Jonathan working with Wes on projects, but also these scenes here and there where Wes is struggling with his own feelings of guilt about himself as a father, and then finding himself unable to communicate.
Yeah.
And it's
well, he didn't, Wes didn't grow up with a father.
Yeah.
And, I remember his wife, Ia, saying, that he told her, when he had young kids, that he was reading books about how to be a father because he had nothing to draw on. And I think because he'd been, somewhat damaged by his childhood, he really was pretty busy, till halfway through his life, almost trying to figure out who he was and trying to kind of cope with what he felt like were his own shortcomings, with some pretty deep insecurities. I mean, with things like actually believing that you're damned. And you carry all of that, all of who you are into a marriage, and into parenthood, and of course into your films, into your stories that you're telling, all of that, that inner life affects the things around you. And it's, I think he did have a really abiding sense of moral responsibility that was like not wanting to visit problems that he had, things that he was trying to work out on other people, especially on your children. You especially don't want to visit that kind of stuff on your children. And I think there was a period in the 70s when his children were still pretty young, where he honestly felt like the best thing for the kids maybe is for me not to be in their lives at all, to not be exerting any kind of influence, because the negative is going to outweigh the positive. And he, there's a whole chapter in the book about this, where he got involved with basically a sex cult, in New York that was exploiting that was like run by these psychologists who had this whole indoctrination thing built around the idea that parents fuck up their children, and the best thing you can do is basically have your children be raised by a community and have as little contact with them as possible. And he did not go all in on that group, because I think he was smart enough to realize pretty early on what was happening there. But he was in therapy his whole life, and he was in therapy to work out those issues when he was newly divorced and had very young children, and was kind of flailing. And then it turned out that his therapists were exploiting him, because they were part of a cult trying to indoctrinate him and take his money and take his kids. And I mean, you can't make this shit up,
that could have made a movie, but it might have been uncomfortably personal.
I mean, he almost, he wrote a script for and almost directed Flowers in the Attic, and I think
Yeah.
that was, I think, a reason why that material, he could have, and I think the reason he was kicked off of it ultimately was because he was going to go too dark with it.
Yeah, well, and incidentally, since you bring up the unproduced Flowers in the Attic script, another thing that I found so useful, and useful is not even a strong enough word, exciting. You combed the archives and found so many script drafts, unproduced scripts, treatment ideas, and you use them to kind of flesh out the career as it's going.
Mm-hmm.
Like we know which movies came out which year, what was happening in between, what else was he developing, what things was, what was he thinking about, what things
Right.
was he developing, and that I think I learned more from your archival work than any other source that I've read. It was just amazing.
Yeah. Well, I want to clarify something here, that there is no Wes Craven archive.
Right.
There should be. I really, and I have tried to push certain people in certain directions to make that happen. I don't know if it ever will. So what I did was, it was, the interviewing over 100 people, tracking down over 100 people, and just asking them about different projects and knowing about some of the stuff that was unproduced, and just having people go, oh yeah, I think I might have a copy of that, or I might, I think I have something that Wes, wrote and gave to me to read for him in college, and it's probably in a box somewhere in the basement or in the attic, or I mean so a lot of that was stuff that I was pulling together. I mean, the exciting thing about the book for me was, as I'm writing this, I'm realizing nobody has pulled all of this together and considered all of this as part of one story before. Nobody's considered how all these things influence each other, because nobody's been aware of all of these things. I did a presentation at one point at the University of Pittsburgh, and Ia, Wes's wife, and his son Jonathan was there, and I got up and just told some anecdotes that other people had told me about Wes's time when he was teaching college. And as I went back down and sat in my seat, and I was sitting next to Ia, and she leaned over and she said, "Thank you for that. You told me things that I didn't know about Wes." And I thought, my God, if she doesn't know, then I kind of feel like nobody knows.
Right.
And have I really taken such a deep dive that I know about things and am connecting things that people in his life who were close to him, didn't know about or hadn't connected. And I'm sure that in a lot of cases it's because the people who knew him as a person weren't analyzing his work for the most part, with a few exceptions. I mean, I think he actually had one assistant who's super smart, who was, putting things together in a really meaningful way and then kind of giving that back to Wes. But for the most part, people came and went from his life, and they were there for a period of time, but there was no perspective on his life that spans the entire story. His life, it's very natural to kind of break it into chapters, because it's, in a different place at a different time with a different group of people. And some lives are like that and some are not, but his was really fragmented. And I think it's, without a book like this, it's been kind of impossible to see the whole and to see the depth of some of what he did, just because a lot of that stuff wasn't and still isn't available, and there really had not been opportunities to pull it all together in that way. So, I mean, I hope that one day, the same way that there's the George Romero archive, I hope that one day there is a Wes Craven archive, because then people can do this. And I do not want this book to be the last word on Wes Craven. We can't top that, so I guess that's done. I mean, that would make me feel really shitty about having done it in a way, because this should be the launch point. I mean, this should be the thing that starts conversations like this, where somebody says, well, let's get on a podcast, let's get on a phone call, because I read the book and there's a few things that were interesting to me that I want to talk more about. It should prompt dialogues, not end dialogues. But it is hard, to have a dialogue, when most people just don't have access to these materials. When you wrote your Hills Have Eyes 2 essay, you didn't have the scripts, and I had found the scripts, I think, after you had written that. And so then when I read your essay, I said, oh, these scripts do exist, but they exist because I tracked down the person who wrote the novelization of The Hills Have Eyes 2, who wrote it under a pseudonym, lives in England, tracked him down and said, any chance you have the scripts? Because I know you would have written the novelization from scripts rather than from the finished film. And at first he kind of laughed me off the phone, and then he came back like a week later and said, it occurred to me that if I do have them, this is where they would be. So he said, I've got 3 drafts, and do you want me to send them to you? Well, yes, I do. And those scripts are now at the University of Pittsburgh, because I donated them to their script collection, because that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is the foremost horror studies collection in the world, at least that I know of, and what better place for them. So I've actually donated a few other Wes scripts there as well, just because there needs to be an archive, and I do not have hard copies of very much stuff, but and some of the other stuff I have I cannot share, but that was part of the deal for me to get it, look at it, and write about it. But I'm just circling my wagons now with this idea of a Wes Craven archive. I mean, I'm just,
Well, it probably won't be at Wheaton, but
I think that's. Although I have to say that there was an archivist at Wheaton who was a big help to me, a guy named Keith Call, and just like reaching out to Wheaton alums and wondering how they're going to feel about talking about Wes Craven, I thought, well, this is reaching out to the archivist at Wheaton. They probably are not into celebrating their connection to Wes Craven, so I'm probably not going to get very far. But Keith Call was amazing. Unfortunately, he's not there anymore. But I think Wes would have been horrified, by the idea of his stuff ending up at Wheaton. But they do have a pretty impressive archive, because they have a lot of the Inklings stuff. I mean, they have all of Tolkien stuff, and C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers and Charles Williams, and I mean, it is a world-class archive, and that's the kind of place where Wes's stuff should be. Just I don't think he had any warm fuzzies about Wheaton. So,
well, maybe at Clarkson where he taught, somebody can make a donation.
Yeah, well, I was thinking Hopkins. They have his Johns Hopkins. Has an impressive archive. They have his the Noah's Ark novel, the manuscript of that, because he did it when he was there. Or the Harry Ransom Center actually has the script for The Fireworks Woman. So believe it or not, there was a script, and what's really crazy about it, it's at the Harry Ransom Center in the Norman Mailer papers. He wanted Norman Mailer, I think, to act a role in that. It might have even been the role that Wes ended up playing himself. I can't remember, but he sent the script to Norman Mailer for feedback, and Norman Mailer, I guess, held on to it. So now it's part of his papers at the Harry Ransom Center. That's nice. Which was another great, that was such a cool discovery to find that. I mean, that was a shot in the dark. Somebody told me about Wes's Norman Mailer collection, and I just got online and said, I wonder where his papers are, and I wonder if. And I looked up the finding aid. Sure enough, there was a script for The Fireworks Woman, These are the kind of things that when you're working on a project like this are like, that was a holy grail moment, because then you could go, all right, what's actually in the script versus what was imposed on him for the sake of making a, commercially exploitable porn movie. What were the things that were so important to him that they're in the script, and where did he embellish on things thematically that you can do in writing, but that wouldn't necessarily come across in the script? And
right.
I could say more, but I'm not going to, because you got to buy the book.
Right. Well, and as that collision of Wheaton and the Fireworks Woman leads me to the first film that many Wheaton alums actually got to see by Wes Craven, which is Music of the Heart.
Yeah.
A lot of horror fans at best ignore Music of the Heart. I encourage people to revisit it because it is truly a Wes Craven movie. Some of his most important themes: economic class, family, dealing with trauma, in this case through music. So this film, there were some new insights that came to it, primarily in casting, some things I didn't know about, which I really...
the Madonna stuff was new to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I really wish I could have tracked down, and I didn't pursue it too hard, so maybe someone else out there will. Someone with an in with Meryl Streep. Apparently Wes... Yeah, so he was doing Music of the Heart for the Weinsteins, who had basically promised him a non-horror movie if he agreed to direct Scream 2. And or was it Scream 3? I can't remember. But he got to do this movie, but they imposed on him Madonna for the lead role. And I think he was not keen on Madonna in that role, but he wasn't, I don't think he was protesting. The thing was moving forward, but at a certain point, Wes's idea of the character and Madonna's ideas for the character just were night and day, and he had to say, "Look, it's not going to work," and that basically killed the movie. And I think they were fairly close to. I think they were in pre-production, and he thought it was dead. And he just made a Hail Mary pass where he wrote a long letter to Meryl Streep, very personal letter that was, probably a version of his life story, saying, "Listen, I've been trying to do this my whole life, and he music was something that I think was one of the things that kind of kept him sane at the moments in his life when he really worried for his sanity, and just a foundation, for him." And he, I'm sure put a lot of that in the letter, and I imagine that that's probably what convinced Meryl Streep to say, "This is such a heartfelt letter. I can't say no to this guy." All she's really said about it, when people bring it up, is, "Yeah, I'm a big pushover, and it was a sweet letter, and I fell for it," and kind of. But I would love to see the letter that convinced Meryl Streep to do the movie. But I have not. I have not seen that. It's funny. You mentioning that. The Wheaton crowd finally had a Wes movie that they could watch. I met and did an interview. Actually, did an in-person interview with Wes's childhood best friend, this guy Brom Bilton, who I tracked down for the book, and he and Wes were born days apart, and Bromley's mother used to watch Wes as a baby. So these were two best friends growing up who'd grown up in the same crib, the same playpen, I was talking to him, and he, I asked him if he'd ever seen any of Wes's movies, and he said, no, it's not, the horror. I can't do those movies. I'm not interested. And I said, well, what about Music of the Heart? And he didn't know about it. So I actually went, after that meeting, I then mailed him a DVD of Music of the Heart, he sent me this really sweet letter, week or two later, whatever it was, and said, we had the whole family. So my kids, the grandkids, everybody got together, and we had the whole extended family, to watch this movie made by, grandpa's childhood best friend, and everybody loved it. And I just thought, Wes would have loved that.
A few minutes ago, you were talking about how Wes probably didn't realize, a lot of the impacts that he made, and would feel humbled by why somebody looking into me so much. Do you, and this might be a personal question, do you realize still what you've done for Wes? Are you able to grapple with the fact that you are delivering this to so many people that are so enamored with this creative individual?
I mean, mostly what I worry about is how many people are actually, reading it and discovering it. Yeah. I feel really good about having done it. I can look at it in a completely selfish way and just go, I got so much out of doing this.
Yeah.
I got to spend, 4 years in Wes's head, like communing with Wes in a, I lived in California for 15 years, so I can get a little woo-woo and say I felt like I was spiritually communing with Wes. It really was. I was so in his head that I was applying his thought processes and some of his beliefs to things that were going on in my real life. And finishing the book was, and putting the book out into the world, just letting it go and going, I'm done researching Wes now, was kind of depressing in a way. Like, oh, I don't know that I want to be done with that. So, that's mainly what I don't so much think about. I hope other people for whom Wes's work is as personally important as it is for me. I hope other people read the book and go, wow, that really deepened my love of Wes and of his films. And that's, again, it's like deepening your appreciation of something that you already love, making you see something you already love in a new way. I hope that it's doing that. There is always that thing. You put a book out into the world and you go, I don't know. Short of the few people who take the time to kind of reach out and say, thank you for that, here's what that meant to me, which most people don't do for a book like this. You don't really know. You put it out there and you go, hey, I feel really good about that. And if nothing else, that meant the world to me. And I do think, from everything that I know about Wes now, I think he would have been happy with the book, even as it gets into some things that are maybe, less palatable, that he'd maybe kind of go, I don't necessarily not everybody needs to know that. We don't need to put that out there. But I think he also, like T.S. Eliot, believed that the whole of a storyteller or an artist's work is important. You don't just hit the high notes, that all of the notes, when you look at them all together, you understand why the high notes are the high notes, because you understand everything that went into it, and everything that they were working out when they weren't at peak form, So I think from that perspective, he would have said, yeah, you can't do a book that is honest in the way that this one is honest without covering everything.
Well, speaking of covering everything, there's one project that, and I actually want to come back to the sentiment that you're expressing here in a bit, but this is probably the only chance I'll get to talk to anyone about the Fountain Society. From Noah's, he always wanted to publish a novel from Noah's Ark on, and as you said, he had the idea for Fountain Society, as early as the 70s.
Yeah, 72.
I find that it is in keeping with his, kind of relentless examination of economic class, in particular, the kind of middle class and upper middle class sort of social divide. You see it in Chiller, you see it in People Under the Stairs, you even see it in the Scream films, I think, and certainly Nightmare on Elm Street. But Fountain Society takes it to a new level as a kind of biomedical sci-fi thriller about cloning that, and I'll shut up as soon as I say that, seems extremely prescient in the fact that right now, the tech bros of Silicon Valley are investing billions of dollars into immortality research. Right? Are you guys? Yeah.
I mean, I think so. I've read Fountain Society a few times, and I've never really loved it. And I think that for as much as I want to say that it's a shame that Wes was never allowed to do his own thing and kind of break away from his brand and tell other types of stories, that I come to Fountain Society going, all right, let's get a Wes Craven story. And then I read it and I go, this is really more like a michaelxcreates story. And that it's not, there's no real element of the supernatural in it. There are spiritual qualities to it. But it's not kind of primal. It's not primal horror in the way, so it's not the things that I think that I love the most about Wes, which is kind of the horror and the metaphysical horror in particular. But I mean, I just reread it, and there's so many little things, little details that are Wes. And I think, when you talk about the themes, when you talk about immortality, kind of an obsession with immortality, that was a theme. One of Wes's friends, somebody who knew him actually in the early 70s when he claimed he came up with this idea, was it a friend? It might have even been Bonnie, his first wife, who said that Wes, with all seriousness, made this claim that he was going to be the first person who lived forever. He was going to be the exception to the rule. And I'm sure that if that's something that he was saying, with some degree of earnestness in the early 70s when he came up with this idea, that that's sort of where Fountain Society comes from. And it's it's like, where does that come from? Does it come from some kind of, vaguely religious belief? Does it come from his having rebounded from the paralysis and given kind of a new lease on life there? Or just sort of an irreverence, I'm almost like I'm going to interpret this feeling that I'm damned as I must have made a Faustian bargain somewhere along the line, and I'm going to live forever because that's what I would ask for in that bargain. And I don't know what the thought process was behind that, but reading the book this time, I was kind of reading it through that lens, and also reading it through, with another theme in mind, which was Wes had an abiding interest in multiple personalities and kind of divided consciousness. I mean, it sort of goes back to earlier talking about the mind-body divide. Just like, how do you, your sense of identity, how do you define the self? It's obviously, it's not just the body. Is it just the brain? Is there a soul? Are there multiple souls? Are there multiple minds? I mean, I think, these are things that those are questions that I think he loved to work out in his stories. And, I mean, I feel like to have kind of a question of how long you want to talk about Fountain Society, probably, because we would have to probably set up for anybody listening kind of the two couples that are in the story, where there's an older couple and a younger couple, and maybe to talk about this effectively, we actually have to give away the ending of the book, and I'm not sure that that's something we want to do. But
simply put, right? The idea is that this sort of elect few are cloned, and the clones get to kind of live their own lives while they're monitored, and then when the time comes, they're harvested. Right. And so that creates, like you, this is not my favorite Craven work, but what's so fascinating about that concept to me is, first, right, the class divide, the rich eating everybody else.
Yeah.
There's a sort of familial thing, right?
Although the clones, as it turns out, are like ultra rich, beautiful people. So
yeah.
A little bit of a stretch, but
but there's the rich and there's the wealthy.
There's the rich and the super rich.
Right.
Yeah,
there's a difference. But also, and this gets back to myth, right? The idea of the father eating the son.
Yeah.
Right.
There's even a Goya reference in the book. I think it was. Yeah.
Without, I wouldn't want to, even though we both kind of gave caveats, I would encourage people to read this novel because, it's the only one Craven got published, and it's
it was almost the last one too, because he had a quadruple bypass within a year, and that was almost it, which was what, like right after Scream 3. Right after Scream 3. So it was like the Scream movies, Music of the Heart, Fountain Society was almost where the story ended. And this would have been, certainly more than Scream 3, I think would have been kind of his final statement. And maybe it would have gotten more attention. Although, there is that branding issue. It's the same issue that Music of the Heart had, which is just like, because it's Wes Craven but it doesn't really fit Wes Craven's brand. I think it's been kind of neglected for that reasons. And I the thing that I really love about this book actually is the ending and where it goes, because it turns out to be a really surprising romance. It turns out to almost kind of be a story about belief in soulmates. And that's really cool. And I didn't, the first time I read it, I didn't see that coming. The second time it was like, oh my God, there were so many clues. How the hell did I miss this?
I think that's the Fireworks Woman connection too. That soulmate thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's like soulmates with complications. Yeah. Yeah. And then the other thing I noticed, the setting, that sort of Wes, the naturalist, the environmentalist. I'm sure that the setting, which is what, it's like an island off Puerto Rico, Vieques Island, I think, and so I looked that up as I was reading the book, because I'd never heard of it before, and they have a big wildlife sanctuary there, and I went, oh, I'm sure Wes went and did the bird watching thing there, because I know he traveled all over the world and went to a lot of different places for bird watching. That was his big passion, and the final line, and it's really a subtle thing. And if it weren't written by Wes Craven, I might not have even kind of keyed in on it. Just this, that island gets kind of reclaimed by nature, because man has sort of been run off with his crazy Frankenstein experiments at the end of the book. And I just went, there is a, that is Wes. Having kind of more faith in nature, or more love for nature than for man's crazy experiments and moral failures. And I loved, reading the book this most recent time, I started off kind of going, these characters, although they're interesting to me, are not relatable in the way that a lot of Wes's characters in his films are sort of related. They don't have an everyman quality about them, that's for sure. Right. But they are very interesting. They are very complex. But by the end, because of the way the story goes, I really really like them, and I really like where he took it. So, yeah, I feel I hold the book in much higher regard after the recent reread than I had in the past. So thanks for prompting that.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to, I think, the final question I have about Wes Craven, which is full circle, right? From Craven's Ravens to Wes Craven's The Birds.
Yeah.
Right? The newspaper, or not newspaper column, but the magazine column he wrote for the Martha
Vineyard Gazette, I think it was.
The Vineyard Gazette. I don't want to say in his dotage, because he wasn't. He was still actively producing and trying to put together project. But he wrote this 8-part. Is that right? 8-part.
Yeah. Well, he was sick in the midst of. I think not at the beginning. He actually had 2 different bouts with cancer, and it looked like he had won the first round. I think at the time he started The Birds, and then I don't remember how many installments he actually wrote after. Basically once he knew he was terminal. I know that the very last one he wrote knowing full well that he had, at most months to live, and as it turned out, I think weeks.
And these are, you can Google these. You can find all 8 installments, and they're very strange and funny and disturbing in places, and very much recall the early columns and that he was writing that they quote from in his early days. So it's I guess morbidly beautiful in a way that
that's a good descriptor. It's hard for me to read them without kind of seeing, Wes had kind of a perpetual smirk on his face, and I just you can read that smirk into every one of these. Yeah,
something I really loved about the idea of him as an artist, the smirk. Yeah.
That was important to I commissioned the cover art from Bill Sienkiewicz, and that was, I wanted that. I didn't want a Freddy glove. I didn't want, anything hokey. I said, I wanted the dark eyes, because he's a horror guy and there's got to be some darkness in it. But the smirk was always there. And any picture you look at, of him it's like this thing of, I know I'm the master of horror, but I can't take myself that seriously. Just that, bouncing back and forth.
That's great. And the font gives you a hint of a slash, right?
On the cover, on the title. It's a little Ralph Steadman quality to it. Yeah.
But the painting, it's gorgeous. I love it.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Jonathan Craven contributed an afterword.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say a word about it, except it is very rare that I cry when I read anything. But a tear came to my eye at the end of it.
That was the eulogy that he delivered at the Directors Guild for Wes's memorial, and I was there, and weirdly sitting in between my friend Tom McLaughlin, who I also wrote a book about, and then on the other side John Landis, and I was crying like a baby, which felt a little weird, but that was very moving. And so that was I specifically went to Jonathan and just said, do you have that written out? Can we use that at the end of the book?
Oh wow.
So I pursued that.
That's great. I recommend everybody check this book out.
That's right. Keep selling that thing.
It's really great. It really truly is.
Yeah, thank you.
And I say that I think that even a casual fan or someone unfamiliar with Craven would find their interest deepened.
Yeah. Well, I think even if you're only interested in a Nightmare on Elm Street, go to the Nightmare and New Nightmare chapters. There's still stuff in there that you haven't. The thing that I have to say, the thing that really bothers me is, as a response to this book, is when people go, "Well, I pretty much knew all of this."
There's no way.
That's when I know that they didn't read the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I just, that's that, and that's kind of what I tell people. It's just like, look, if you're actually interested in knowing more about anything that Wes did, there's new stuff in here about all of it.
Yeah, so many great details. I kept coming back. You never can predict the detail that's going to obsess you. But towards the end, and I guess you got this from Ia's wife, you share a list of periodicals that he subscribed to. And it's like 30.
Yeah, it's like a full page. Yeah.
But it's amazing. It's all these ornithology, bird watching things, and carpentry. He had become a carpenter, and, film and learning out the New Yorker. And just it was good. I thought that you included it because I think so many people's, especially in the pre-internet age, so many people's periodical subscriptions were an indication of the person they wanted to be. Because nobody can read all that shit. I subscribe to 5, and the stacks of unread periodicals are just, my wife wants to burn them to the ground.
Well, I think to go back to Fountain Society briefly, I think there's so many ideas in there about developments in science and different. I mean, just the breadth of his knowledge about so many, or the breadth of his interest in so many different things, I think is reflected in that book, and often in very kind of anecdotal ways. I mean, he was just a deeply curious person, and I think Wes had told me about subscribing to more different publications than he could ever possibly read. And so I went to Ia and said, I want a list.
Yeah.
And she came back with that list and was just like, and I'm sure I'm missing things. This is from memory. So
and it does. It shows that breadth of interest and the kinds of things that the other thing that I found really interesting anecdotally, is you include some of this in the appendices. Mm-hmm. Two really important things in the appendices is you share a list of music that Craven found really important, and it struck me that it suddenly made sense. He wasn't really a rock and roll guy.
Yeah.
It's jazz, it's opera.
And opera, yeah. Classical, a lot of classical. Yep.
Right. Totally makes sense given his upbringing that he would gravitate towards this stuff, and a beautiful selection. But then you include something that is really on brand for you, which is a mixtape that you made for Craven that did include quite a bit of rock and roll. And I wonder, is that something that you were able to give to him, or is that that was a playlist that I started making from just doing digging, finding different things that he'd written, allusions that he made to certain songs or lyrics in his scripts, things that people would talk about that they heard him listening to, things that he played on guitar. So everything in there has some direct, and I couldn't even now look at that list and tell you what all the connections are, but I mean, I was making a playlist as I was researching. And so all of those songs, even though it's my mixtape for Wes, all of them have a specific relationship to his life. Maybe not something that he would have picked, but something that somebody close to him picked that they associated with him. One of the, it's funny because as you asked earlier, what were the big, moments in the course of doing this that meant a lot to you, or that were these big aha moments. And
And I only kind of remember them as you're prompting them, because there's so many. But I remember when I interviewed Jessica Craven, and we talked for a while, and at a certain point, somehow we got on the subject of mixtapes, because as you say, that's on brand for me. It all comes back to that at some point. And she said, "Yeah, I have all these mixtapes that my dad made me, in the early '90s." And I can't remember. I think there's a track list for one of them in the appendix, maybe the four punch mix that he made a mixtape for Jessica that was like a tribute to the family dog that had just passed away, this dog that he loved. And it starts with just the most melancholy. But she
Keith Jarrett piece, yeah.
Yeah. And she loaned me that mixtape. I mean, I drove over to her house, and she gave me this like shoebox of like some tapes and some letters and stuff. And I mean, I was just like, Wes Craven made mixtapes. Knew there was a reason I loved that guy. And it was a good mix. I mean, I think Jessica didn't have anything you could play a cassette anymore. So I transferred it to a digital file, and then, used Shazam to make make a list of the songs, and turned it into a Spotify list and sent it to her, and then put it in the book, because I mean, if you're a Wes Craven fan, you can go queue up the Wes Craven Spotify list. That's cool, right?
Best way to get to know someone is to get a mixtape.
There you go.
And on that note, to share some Joe Maddrey love, I got to share that a few years ago, fell deeply in love with Analog Love that you were able to be a writer of. And as somebody that grew up with mixtapes myself and discovering music where there are certain tracks that are not related to others at all, but you always envision that track playing after a certain track because it's a tape you played, thousands of times. The documentary Analog Love has been a major impact on me, so thank you for that.
Yeah. Oh, that. I mean, again, I'll just be selfish and say that did a lot for me too. I mean, that really kind of reinvigorated my enthusiasm for music, and it did it at a time that had sort of long-lasting effects, because it was right after my daughter was born, and she's now about to turn 11, and she's a singer, and music is just the most important thing in the world. I mean, she would say that without hesitation, that music is that is her stronghold. And a lot of I remember we'd done an interview. My buddy Rob, who directed that, had done an interview. What's her name? The lead singer of Morningwood, Chantal Claret, and I kind of went, oh yeah, I sort of vaguely remember, remember that band and that. So that Morningwood song, what is now I'm blanking on the song, but that became my daughter's first favorite song. Like because I was doing that documentary and putting together mixtapes, Nth Degree was the song, and she that's like the first thing I can picture my little, like however old she, 1 or 2, bopping her head around, I guess it wasn't 1, there was no head bopping at that age, but not intentionally anyway. I still make a playlist, every month. My daughter and I trade music, and doing that project, when I did it, actually became sort of part of our dynamic. And I had not done much with mixtapes or thought about mixtapes that much in the, at least 10 years probably before that.
Right.
So yeah, that was important for me too, to kind of come back around to that. So thank you. I'm glad you've discovered that.
Very, very, very early on, yeah. And I've shared it with many people. In fact, I bought a couple extra copies to give away to people because I
still do that too, yeah.
That meaningful, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have conversations with people, just, are you into mixtapes? And,
Yep.
And sometimes you'll just get a flat no, but you never just get a simple yes. You get an essay. You get an essay answer to that question. So.
Well, listen, I intended on asking about 30 more questions, but I know we're getting close to the time. It's 2024, right? The Soul of Wes Craven. It's the 40th anniversary of Nightmare on Elm Street, 28th anniversary of Scream, and the 20th anniversary of Joe Maddrey's first book, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, which
that makes me feel old.
Started out, I want to mention this, as a college professor, this book started out as an independent study project in college for you. As somebody who's conducted about 100 independent studies over my career, I tell them every single time, this is your chance to write or produce anything you want. You can take it anywhere you want. You are living proof that an independent study can go productive direction.
I did not realize when I pitched that independent study that these standards, the expectations of an independent study were lower than I had imagined. I thought you think about the amount of work that you're supposed to do in a semester in any course, and I have to design something that is just as much work, that is as if I'm going to that class 2-3 times a week and learning a massive amount of material in a relatively short amount of time. And so I remember going to the advisor. I had sort of a formal advisor and then sort of an informal advisor who I just wanted to kind of be on board with it. And I remember going to one of them, I can't remember which one, and got it approved, and then found out sometime later that he had gone to the other one and was just like, did you see this? This is fucking ridiculous. This guy's never going to do all this work. We'll be lucky if we get one chapter of this thing. And I started doing it, and it was every week or every other week, I had to turn in, a full chapter. And then at some point, like halfway through the semester, the dialogue changes, and one of the two advisors goes to the other one and says, he just keeps coming back with more chapters. And so, at the, I did the independent study because I wanted to get a film minor, which was very new, or a film studies minor, which was very new at the school that I was at. And there just flat out weren't enough classes yet for me to graduate when I was supposed to graduate and still pick up that film minor. I would have had to pay for another semester. So I did the independent study just to fill in the gap. And then I graduated as an English major, which means I had no idea what I was going to do whatsoever, no idea how to make money. How do you even look for jobs? What do people do for a living? I knew nothing. All I knew was I was a writer, so I was submitting a lot of short stories, and I submitted this manuscript to 2 different publishers, and all the fiction stuff that I was doing that I thought was my ticket bounced back. Just like Wes, I went through that rejection phase. But the nonfiction book manuscript, one of those 2 publishers said, actually they said double the length. They wanted it longer than it was, and we'll publish it. So I think actually the independent study was really just the first half, which is the decade by decade, and then the second half, which is a study of individual directors, kind of mini biographies in a way. That was the part that I wrote my first year out of college in order to get the book published. And I don't know. It depends on which ones you count, I guess. I mean, there've been some really, really small ones, and then some collaborative things, and it's like, which ones do I feel like? I was incredibly involved for about 10 years with working on a biography of Bruce Joel Rubin, who won the Oscar for Ghost and wrote Jacob's Ladder and Deep Impact and Brainstorm and a bunch of other stuff. And we got to a certain point where he wanted to just kind of take what we had done and turn it into a true autobiography. And because there were things that I didn't even know to ask about, and he wanted to take it and put it. I had written it. I won't say I had written it in his voice. I mean, it came entirely from interviews that I had done with him, interviews he'd done elsewhere, and so it was a little bit choppy as a result. But he just said, I want to go through and edit this whole thing, give it a more consistent voice, and I want to add. I mean, he doubled the length of that book, just adding things that I would have never known to even ask him about, and that was published earlier this year too. So it's called "It's Only a Movie." I have here. Let's flash that while we're doing this shameless self promotion. That's Bruce's book, and it's a damn good book, and I feel close to that, even though, my name is not on it, but that's okay. Because it's just like the Wes thing. It's like, if you're in a position to kind of push something out into the world, you have kind of a duty to do that. And I mean, Bruce will be the first to say, would never have occurred to him to write a book. So he but he's really happy that he did, and I'm really happy that it's out in the world. So yeah, this is what I do. I'm gonna keep doing it until I guess until my brain fails me. I don't know, brain or body or soul, who knows? Something will fail me eventually. That's where this story ends for all of us, right?
Well, that's the thing, right? We keep bringing things into the world one way or another.
Trying.
That's
yeah.
it. That's all it is.
Well, as we've said like 25 times, by the Soul of Wes Craven from the Soul of Joseph Maddrey. You should be checking this out. It's a great read. I will be linking as many of the things as possible in the description for everybody listening and or watching this. Anything else coming up in the future that you're working on that you can hype up?
I'm working on two things, two book projects. And I don't know, they may both go forward, or neither of them may go forward. So I'm not ready to talk about them yet. It's been a little daunting after 4 years on Wes and feeling so good about that, to go, what do I want to do that is important enough to me to spend the next, 4 or 5 years of my life doing it? And as you get older, those kind of questions do weigh on you a lot more. So, and I don't probably write as fast as I used to. I think I've only become more obsessive, and especially about the research, and that's an investment of time. But that's the thing to me that's really valuable at this point, is trying to find things that other people aren't paying attention to, and make sure that there is a version of that exists for the people who care.
Well, thank you for your time, as we just alluded to in an existential way. A big highlight, too, for the amount of things that you've worked on that are capturing voices that, like you said earlier, we're literally losing in the process of many of these creative endeavors. And without people like you, it wouldn't exist. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for setting this up, Will. And everybody, please go follow Joe everywhere that I link, and make some purchases. You will not regret it.
That's right. It's Christmas. Go to town.
That's right. Oh, we're recording on Friday the 13th. It's the wrong franchise, but it seems like the right time.
I have an anecdote for that.
Oh.
Which I think is not in the book, because it was kind of a second-hand anecdote. And I was like, well, I don't know if I entirely trust that source, but supposedly, Wes told someone very close to him, and this has not been verified by Sean Cunningham, but that the first rough cut of Friday the 13th was not landing. So Wes, who had started his career in film as an editor for Sean Cunningham, recut Friday the 13th, and that the cut of Friday the 13th that we know and love, Wes Craven had a big hand on that, and I think. There are moments that I've always loved, like just the lake as the storm rolls in right before Kevin Bacon gets killed, where I just go, that feels very Wes Craven to me, that little nature and revolt touch. as a bit of foreshadowing. I could see Wes going, that's what you need here, that type of thing.
Wow.
So there you go, thematic.
Perfect. I love that.
What a way to end this. Thank you for watching The Disconnected. On the way out, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel, that you've liked the video, and that you've copied the link to be able to share with someone else that may appreciate this.